Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okigbo, founding partner Nextier. Nextier is a multi-competency advisory firm focused on solving Africa's complex development challenges. About 133 million Nigerians are multidimensionally poor. Let that number sink in for a little bit. It's a huge number. I mean, that figure is more than the population of many countries. In fact, of the 195 countries and territories around the world, only 9 countries have populations greater than Nigeria's poverty figure. About 1 out of every 10 people living in poverty is a Nigerian. These are huge numbers. And indeed, poverty is probably the biggest challenge we face in Nigeria today. It's at the root of many of the other socioeconomic challenges we have. My guest today, Olushola Afolayan, has joined me to unpack this big issue, to look at the causes of poverty and the potential solutions. Shola and I go back about a decade when she was with PIND, that Chevron Corporation funded development program in the crude oil-rich but desperately poor Niger Delta region of Nigeria. Since then, she's moved on to bigger and better things. She served as senior special advisor to the Ondo State government, focused on job creation and multilateral coordination. Subsequently, she worked for the presidency as the national coordinator for Nigeria's multidimensional poverty policy. Her MBA program at the uber-prestigious Said School of Business at the University of Oxford exposed her to the seminal works of Professor Sabine Alkire, who's at the Oxford Poverty and Human Development Initiative, on which Nigeria's multidimensional poverty index is based. And Shola coordinated that effort, the first time Nigeria is doing it at the subnational level. Shola, you're welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Patrick. Yeah, grateful.
Fantastic. Now let's start with a definition, right? Who do you consider to be poor within Nigeria's context? How do you define poverty?
Okay, so you can look at poverty in 2 dimensions, right? And interestingly, the second part is actually a multidimensional aspect of looking at poverty. The first one is the monetary terms in which people look at poverty. And so if you're earning like $1.90 less, per day, that means you are considered as poor. In Nigeria, if you translate that to a Naira, according to the MBS, that would mean about, what figure is that now? Just less than 200,000 income per year. So you'll be identified as being poor if that is the case for an individual and also an household. But then you also look at the multidimensional poverty index that is being pushed forward by the UNDP and Oxford University from their OFI, which you have quite mentioned. And also the World Bank now does the measurement as such. So the multidimensional poverty says that people can be multidimensionally deprived. And that will look at shocks and security like we have in Nigeria. So if you are impacted by the insecurity issues in Nigeria and it impacts your economic activities or social activities, you are deemed to be poor. You also look at the health, access to education, and quite a number of suites of indicators or dimensions that are looked at. So you look at it in a multidimensional way to identify that people are poor. So that's the definition, kind of like high-level definition of what poverty is.
Now, but when I look at the way Nigeria has defined its poverty number, right, it places the threshold at about 137,430 per annum per person, right? And if you break that down, it comes to about 380 Naira per day, which is far less than the $1.90 per person. So have we shifted the goalpost in terms of this benchmark number? That's the first question. Then the second question is, should we actually be fixated on this figure, right? Given that from the multidimensional poverty reflections, that one may be monetarily poor, i.e. people who are in rural Nigeria, but not food poor. You know, if most of the living cost is lower in rural Nigeria. How do you help me understand these numbers?
Okay, so the first one, I'll beg you to repeat the second one when I get there. So the first one is, have we shifted the goal in terms of the figures? So the figures just quoted are 2018, 2019. But in Nigeria is so big, and doing surveys is quite money consuming. So MBS has not set the new standard. Usually, when all bank gives $1.90, what is the equivalent in Nigeria? You know the fluctuation of the forex in Nigeria currently. So that definitely has changed, and it will be at par. So if you look at it currently, maybe it's 1,400 to $1 now. So that would be the equivalent of the $1.90. So this equivalent that we're looking at isn't what it is as we speak, was just 2018, 2019 definition of that. Yeah, so that has not changed because it's a global standard that is accepted in terms of monetary measurement for poverty. So what was the second? Okay.
The second question is, if I look at my aunt, right, in the village, you know, she may not earn a lot of naira, right? But her cost of living is also much lower than if she lived in the city, right? The home she lives in is paid for. She's not paying rent. The food that makes up, you know, the basket of food that she eats, most of it may come from the farms, right? So if we are fixated on a number for evaluating poverty, are we looking at the right thing? You know, because some people may not, you know, you may not be able to quantify them on the monetary figure they have earned, you know, because most of what constitutes what they eat and use comes from sources that we're not tracking. So I'm really trying to get into, when you guys ran the multidimensional poverty index, you know, how did you take care of these people who may not earn income on a daily basis?
Okay, so the MPI survey did not consider consumption or the monetary values, because that is left for the monetary assessment and measurement. However, it did look at the living standards of people. So you know that during COVID, people that had issues around their housing system were more susceptible to being contracting the virus, right? And it's, if I have a small hut and I cook within the household, that means I could have health-related issues like respiratory problems, and that is one key factor that actually makes you more susceptible to those viruses. So those are the interlinkages that you have between, like, you know, infrastructure, health system, and education. So because someone is not paying for a particular house does not make the person not poor. And it's just, you know, because Nigeria, we've been so used to the basic stuff being denied or not having those, so we think, okay, the person is not impacted. Aside that, so you can have someone having like food insecurity. You can, within the rural areas, the figures are quite lower than those in the south, in the urban area, and it's because of the example that they are given, where access to fresh food and nutritious food are quite there. However, we make some assumptions that is what obtains in the rural area, because you can see that the figures that we have for the rural poverty versus the urban poverty is quite high. It's almost like, it's almost going to 70% of our
80%? Yeah.
Yeah. So having access to nutritious food is different from having access to food. So you see people within the rural areas where if you're a farmer and you are eating corn and maize and maize and maize in the morning, in the afternoon, in the night, you get what I mean? It doesn't. And of course, there's some education around using, like moringa is quite rife available in a lot of places, but they don't have the education to know that you can mix it with different food for you to have the nutrition. So there's difference between having access to food, but having access to quality food. So, but the data is quite interesting as we are getting into, and then, but it does disaggregate, identify the intensity or the incidences, how people experience poverty. If I have a small house, like for instance, the NASCO is the custodian of the National Social Register. So what they do is they look at a particular household and say, how many bulbs are within a house? you have access, you have windows, you know, if you don't have windows, you are, you know, mosquito and then health issues and so. So it's quite related. You can't isolate an issue and then define the person as non-poor.
Exactly. And so let me come back to this monetary poverty discussion, right? What is monetary poverty? And what does the data say about it? And what are poverty's multifaceted dimensions in Nigeria?
Okay, so we've touched a bit on the monetary poverty, and I must confess that I'm not an expert when it comes to that. You probably will be speaking with the Assistant General of the, you see, that's another thing when you look at multidimensional, so energy deprivation, yeah. So it's good that I had an alternative that I can explore. But anyway, so in terms of the monetary poverty, right? So if you have, I will use an example of COVID. During COVID, if majority of the people that are poor are informal workers, right? And there was a lockdown. So that time people were more impacted because they are daily earners. They couldn't go out to do some earnings and stuff. And also there are some other factors that insecurity that affect the kind of elective officials that you have that squander funds that are meant for the public. So that impact the consistency in which people can earn at least $1.90 per day. So the standard is $1.90 per day interpreted to the current Forex interpretation. So if you are not earning like income or being gainfully employed, $1.90 per day, you are termed as poor, monetary poor in Nigeria.
Now, when it comes to poverty's multifaceted dimensions in Nigeria, you know, how did the multidimensional poverty index, you know, look at the multifaceted dimensions of poverty in Nigeria?
Yeah, so I will be counted as energy poor. So now there's a global MPI. MPI is multidimensional poverty index. So that is the index that is used to grade different the intensity or the incidences of poverty globally. So and there are different indicators and dimensions. Dimensions would mean, for instance, sector. So for Nigeria, we looked at work and shocks. We look at unemployment because that was a key factor that is important in Nigeria, given our population in terms of youth. We also looked at health, we looked at education, and then there was another set that was done for the child poverty to look at, you know, the nitty-gritty of the kind of poverty that children face within households and individually. So multifaceted way, I'll just paint the picture. That's just one thing I've experienced, or something that the Minister of Power is trying to resolve, to say, if you're on band A, you are supposed to have at least 20 hours of light. So, but I know that there are surveys that we have conducted, for instance, in Ondo State, in the riverine areas, that people have not had electricity in the past 17 years. So, and these people are farmers. I mean, they are fishermen, yeah? And so you can imagine the kind of the poverty cycle that they experience. So if you don't have electricity, you are not going to have cold storage, and then you are forced to only catch what you can sell per day, right? So, and if you have almost like a leftover by the evening, you know that it's going to get spoiled. You have, you know, to sell it at a loss. So you see people just that perpetuates poverty within those communities, and those communities also don't have schools, don't have good sanitary water sanitation and wash.
Water and sanitation.
Yeah, and so it just one triggers the other. So that's the cycle. So, but for Nigeria, we decided that we are going to look at our 4 dimensions, which have mentioned, and also several indicators to help us to identify deep down what those mean. So that's the multidimensional poverty.
Sure. I like the way you presented it. So if we take that view and we look at Nigeria, and we look at this moniker that Nigeria took on as the poverty capital of the world, although I think we've kind of given it up now to India. What would you say? Would you agree that Nigeria is really that poor, using the multidimensional poverty index to look at the country, or not?
Well, so that's what we call facts, right? Nigeria is not the poverty capital of the world because of the data. However, I am of the opinion that you need to compare apple to apple, right? So we have those that are top top winners when it comes to poverty are, South Sudan, where you have 82.3%, Equatorial Guinea, 76.8%, Madagascar, Guinea-Bissau, Eritrea, South, so you have quite a number of them. But Nigeria is about 40% in terms of both monetary and in monetary figures. Yeah, but you can't compare the population, like you rightly said. We are over 211 million compared to those kind of countries where you have almost 100% of their population being poor. But when you compare Nigeria to India, right, that's when you now say you are comparing apple to apple. But still, Nigeria is not India. Yes, India supersedes or surpass Nigeria when it comes to poverty, both in monetary and in multidimensional poverty. Yeah,
and also in absolute number of people who are poor and in percentages. So I thought it was a good question to ask, because we really need to shed that that toga and hand it over to the people who should have it. But let's also look at what are the underlying root causes of poverty in Nigeria. And again, I'd like you to probably look at it from the different regional disparities or maybe even the rural-urban divides. What do we see as the root causes? Because if we don't understand that, then we can't go to how do we get out of it.
Yes, absolutely. So I know you would share after this meeting very detailed disaggregated data around poverty, which had shared only for the NPI, I must confess, that shows by the state, at state level, at regional level, regional being the geopolitical zones that we have in Nigeria, and also urban rural areas and the senatorial district. Unfortunately, we couldn't go to what level, the LGA level and what level, which is quite where the data would be quite revealing. And so what the data showed us that at the national level, we had, at the rural level, we had almost 70% of the people are poor. And so that's over 105 people. So nationally, we have 133 million people that are poor. That's in definitive figures is 132.9, but approximately that's 133. And that's what we hear everywhere. 133 million Nigerians are multidimensionally poor, right? And then out of this 133 million, you have the rural people living in rural areas accounting for about 70% of that. So that's about 105 million people that are within the rural areas that are experiencing multidimensional deprivations. And of course, the urban is quite low. Then we have just about 30% of that. And that's about 27 million people that are multidimensionally poor. In terms of region also, you have the highest number of poor are concentrated in the Northwest. So people here, because of the insurgencies in the Northeast had never really come out to be the most poor, no matter the in terms of the monetary or the MPI or several even data that's done, also data that are done by maybe Ministry of Health, maybe Ministry of Education. People actually go to school more even in the Northeast that we experience in the Northwest. That's quite an interesting, and that's the facts of the figures. So we have the highest number of concentration of poverty at the Northwest, accounting for about 29%. So that's 28.4% figure. Then the next one, interestingly, is we have, so there's a population share. So we have more people, because if I look at the population share in terms of the percentage of people that are poor, the Southwest will come next. And the Southwest will be accounting for 19.2. So but we know that the figures is not exactly so because the population is quite different, right? So the number of poor people within the Southwest is about 16 million. And the highest number is the Northwest that I said is about 45 5 million. However, if you look at the number of poor people in terms of the hierarchy, we have the Northwest 45.4%. The next region is the Northeast, 20.4%. The North Central is 20%. Then you have the South as 19.6%. You have the Southwest is 16.2%. And the lowest poor, the least poor in Nigeria in terms of region is the Southeast, that you have the 10.8%.
Yeah, but so what's causing this poverty? What's at the root cause? Is it a lack of access to education? You know, how do we begin to understand why the Northwest is much poorer than the Northeast? You know, or the Southeast seems to be in this league table, which we don't even want to be considering, the least poor. You know, we should actually be looking at, you know, a league table of how wealthy we are, but unfortunately, we're looking at a poverty league table. So how do we explain the root causes, you know, of this poverty and why there's that regional variation?
Yeah, so I must say that a lot of post-survey research have been done to explore why. Like you know, surveys only tell us what the data is saying, what the reality is, and a lot is being explored. However, I would mention, for instance, I mentioned Ondo State, right? Ondo State, I don't see any state within the Southwest that are experiencing energy poverty that haven't seen, as you know, don't have access to electricity, energy for in the past 17 years, like consistently. Those are the kind of things that the data brought out. The other thing is that if you look at in terms of education, you always hear maybe it's the JAM exam that is being done, or the WAEC. You have the highest number of those that are distinction, or the highest number of enrollment within the Southeast. So this, if you look at the indicators, show us why. So if you look at all the about 15 indicators that are asked on the field when the survey was being conducted, and then when people respond. So like I've mentioned, what are the enrollment rates in the Southeast in terms of education indicator versus in the Northwest or in the North Central? So those are the things that will make the Northeast the Southwest quite not too much susceptible to that. But when you look at infrastructure, you know, you see the figures go high. I can share a picture of, you know, the different dimensions and the indicators and how each of the states, not just the region or the central district, but each of the states perform in terms of all of the indicators. So in the aggregate of the indicators, you have the Southwest, you know, showing least. And like I said, even though Ondo State is more energy poor, it is the least poor country, the least poor state in Nigeria. That's quite interesting because it's an aggregation. But you can't look at aggregation. You have to look into what the data is really saying. So that helps you then to identify which areas can we align budgeting. And that takes you to, you know, that just a direct response to what are the root causes. The indicators tell us what the root causes are. It tells us what issues are and where you are thriving and where you shouldn't, where you should do more of all the issues. And then it comes under education, it comes under living standards, it comes under water resources and the health and the likes about that, yeah.
So Ondo is an interesting place, right? Because it's seen as the least poor in the Southwest, you know, but there are some parts of Ondo that are more desperately poor than even some parts of the Niger Delta, you know, that's really, really desperately poor. And I think the key differentiator here would be, say, access to infrastructure, right? You know, within Ondo. Now, whilst you were working as an advisor to the Ondo State government, did any of these data feed into the decisions government was making in terms of budgeting, in terms of programming? Did any of the data, insights from the data, seep into the conversations?
So yeah, so so you can see the MPI survey was done, conducted in 2022 up to January 2023. And yeah, no, I think that was 2021 into January 2022 or whatever, right? And the result was not published until November last year. So the data had not been used to inform a lot of policy change. However, there were a lot of different, Nigeria is quite good when it comes to survey, it comes to reports, and then we put on the shelf, what do we use those information for? So there is now a drive around data demand and use for the NPA to say, can you sit and look at what this data is saying? And quite interestingly, even though when the report was launched and Ondo State government was, jubilating and said, we are the least poor in Nigeria, we have to quickly say, stop, can you step back and look at, can you look at where the issues are? Because this is contributing a lot to the intensity of the poverty that people face. So a lot of programmatic changes and in terms of policy, in terms of budgeting, like you have rightly said, so that you allocate the appropriate budget to what sector that is needing the urgent requirement. Interestingly, when this survey was going to start, I think it started about 2020, the conversation just when the COVID was just up there. Sabina had come into the country. We had visited Governor El-Rufai at the time. It was quite influential within the Nigerian Government's Forum because that is the subnational level where change can be. He wanted to know. He wanted to know, for instance, for Southern Kaduna, what are the issues that they face? Is it more of education? Is it more, of course, it's obvious, insecurity, the health, so that the budget of the next year will be allocated, to address
that problem.
To solve that problem. And that is what it is. So, and interesting, we had a champion within the ministerial system at the time, the former Minister of Budget and Planning was changed to economic planning now. A champion the cause such that when this report,
Clem Abba, right?
Yes, Prince Clem Agba. So, and of course, it's quite savvy when it comes to this kind of work, wanting to make sure that the systems and the policy and the budget are aligned. The budget office was right under his purview. So what he did was to make sure that the allocation of budget for 2023 kind of it was similar to addressing so unfortunately, he wasn't there to make sure to see that implemented. Like you would know that Nigeria operates something they will call the envelope system when it comes to budgeting. Now it has to be more evidence-based to provide. We can't continue to tout, we want to reduce poverty, and then we are not designing appropriate policy to address that. Our budgeting system, budgeting cycle or system is not addressing those, or the designs in terms of the subsidies or interventions that are created are not pinpointing to, and we have a lot to learn in terms of that. Of course, India, it did successfully.
And leadership plays a key role in this. I mean, we worked, my firm supported Clem Abba on another project, which was again very data-driven, and we found him to be a great leader, in terms of those types of issues. But it brings me to another question, which is our goal as a country, right, is to exit or lift 100 million Nigerians out of poverty by 2030, right? 6 years' time. Massive. Are you privy to the thinking that led to this figure, this 100 million figure? Or is it another arbitrary number that we pulled out of the air? If yes, how did we arrive at that? If no, what are some plans that you are aware of that government is looking to use in actualizing this goal?
Right. Okay. So when the pronouncement was made by the former president, it was about 2019, just at the start of his second tenure, and there wasn't COVID at the time. We didn't see that coming. So, for instance, India that had exited a quarter of a billion people out of poverty now becomes the world poverty capital of the world, right? The capital of poverty right now. Because some long-term systemic things that should have been done that are not done. And that's why just doing subsidies and transfers are not enough. So the 100 million pronouncement, the presidential pronouncement at the time was not based on the realities that happened that COVID brought in. So what was done by the vice president at the time, there was what was set up, the ERGP, Economic Recovery and Growth
Plan.
Yes, it looked at almost all of the sectors to quickly bounce, rejig the entire economic system. So you have, agriculture was quite impacted. You have the health sector. So that was like an immediate 1 year or 1.5 year plan that was thrown. So as soon as that ended, so the NPRGS was started, and the NPRGS is a National Poverty Reduction with Growth Strategy. And that was where the NPI came in. And that's where the NPI was then looking at, the NPRGS was looking at all of the MDAs. What are the things that we can, because it was then at the time we're thinking the chicken or the egg. Should we quickly do the NPI survey and then use the survey to develop the NPRGS as it was, or just we know what the issues are? Because there's a global NPI that is done anyway, whether Nigeria does a national NPI. And the results were quite similar. So those were what informed the suite of projects or programs that were funded within the NPRGS at the time. So I hope I've not lost my train of thought in terms of answering.
So it's along. I think you've kind of indicated how we arrived at 100 million, a bit arbitrary. Then COVID happened. We did not go back to recorrect it, but I think the MPI has told us now that it's 133 million, so aiming for 100 could be decent. I'm not sure why we're not aiming for the 133, seeing that a lot more people are dropping into poverty every day. Now, the next question is really, how do you achieve that goal? So what are some of the poverty alleviation first, and then eradication second programs that the government is thinking of? What are some of the ones that the Buhari administration tried to implement that will probably be carried over by this new administration, seeing that they're part of the same political party? And what are you hearing today that the current administration is considering doing to alleviate in the immediate and then eradicate, over time?
Okay, so I like the use of 3 words. So alleviation, reduction, and eradication, right? So the alleviate, if I use it in my own terms, would be the immediate, to cushion whatever effect that is happening. So that's why during President Jonathan's time, when the subsidy was removed, Shopee was set up, right? And also when this current administration came in, there was a conversation around subsidy, and there was a lot of scrambling here and there to quickly set up a project that would, or a program, or a set of program that would address that. I must first say that I don't think we can ever eradicate poverty, because globally or in Nigeria, that means everybody, there is no poverty anyway, because poverty is also behavioral. There are a lot of behavioral changes that need to happen. Even if Nigeria wanted to do universal basic income, it cannot do that because there is paucity of funds. That's never going to go away, right?
I will accept that. Even the Bible says that the poor will always be among us. Yeah.
Yes, among us. So that's not gonna. So when people say eradication, I say, no, we can't get there. But we can reduce poverty, and we can reduce it one sector at a time, one zone at a time, one indicator at a time. Because, and for instance, and then not to pass it to the next generation, because that's why we didn't just look at the national NPI for Nigeria. We also looked at child poverty, because when a child is living in a household where he has to go and hug instead of going to school, then it perpetuates a cycle of poverty for that generation, So in terms of the poverty reduction and alleviation projects that the government has done, I could be critical on some of this because I've had first-hand experience. So I used to, work as an embedded advisor during the time when the Shopee was being implemented. Shopee was quite robust because we had good work that was being done in terms of access to market. Because when we solve a lot of food insecurity issues or scarcity, we solve a lot of issues, right? And Nigeria will have a lot of arable land. But unfortunately, that was not continued, maybe because of corruption, blah, blah, blah. That happened. But it's something that would actually stimulate a lot of reduction in terms of poverty. And I know the government of President Buhari at the time replaced that with AFJP. AFJP is Agri for Job and Food Plan or something like that. And it looks at rural roads. So working with the Ministry of NEMA, what's the called? The people that look at the rural roads and the urban roads. FEMA, yes, FEMA address all of those issues. So that's one criticism I would have for the last administration, that wasn't continued. But we hope that this new administration will be able to continue that very work that was done in terms of agriculture and the likes of that. And so then we had the last administration did for the first time like a big project where we had about 500 billion naira spent per year. The past was 7 years, because it wasn't started in 2016, it was started in 2016 for about 7 years. So you have 500 billion being used for what we call the NSIP, National Social Investment Program. And it was supposed, originally, it was just fantastic. It was supposed to be a household targeted, because when you address household issues, then you reduce the poverty levels required reduced. And that was what was done in India. So we had, they had the homegrown school feeding program, where is homegrown, where the nutritious food are, where you can find within the community. So there isn't issues around, movements of food and stuff. So it addresses issues around enrollment in schools. It also does in terms of income for the father, who is a farmer, the mother who becomes the cook. And of course, within that education sector was also brought in what we call the Empower. You have those that are graduates that have been deployed to school to address the issues, gaps around teacher-student ratio. When children are trooping to school as a result of they can eat, and their data and research that says because they don't eat breakfast, and then it affects their educational outcomes and stuff. Now they can get to school. If you get to school, why are they not having teachers with them? So you see the father, the mother, the graduate child also being deployed in the circle. And then of course you have access to loans. So we see that a lot of these people they are not banked. So that was where the government Employment and Enterprise Program was done through the BUI, Bank of Industry, and they were the ones that brought this. So for instance, if you have for the meal for the day, you have maybe akara and pap, or you have something. So if you can't buy in bulk, so your profit will be eroded. So you have the Jeep supporting these cooks and some other MSMEs around. So it was supposed to be a household holistic day, but it became isolated. And so it wasn't quite tracking, because the issue that when monitoring and evaluation and research was done, or impact evaluation, it was discovered that people that have been within the register or been given cash since 2016, they've not graduated from poverty. So
and that's why I want to go with the the Nigeria, the interventions we saw under Buhari, right? What are some of the criticisms? What are some of the design errors with that program? So first of all, that comes to mind is cash transfer, right? For a country where you can't properly identify who's poor, and where we have real corruption, right? So if you're doing physical cash transfer, isn't that just a recipe for perpetuating corruption? Couldn't we have done electronic transfers? And I'm going to, first of all, admit that I understand the issues with financial inclusion, etc., in some of these rural parts. But with the spread of phones and so on, couldn't we have found a solution that is technology-driven that will limit the possibility of corruption and ensure that the people actually get the monies?
Yeah, so good question. I handled at the time the monitoring and evaluation of the NC program within the first 3 years, and there was an assessment that was done thereafter. We had no reason to give people cash. that's just the reality. Why are we giving people cash? So we have people that you give them the 5,000 that is been given, they cross over the other road and they go to the bank and deposit it. The evidence is abundant. Prior to the cash transfer being done, people, a lot of trade and barter, people trade. So and people that are trading do have how they how they keep their money. And that was why the JIP program was introduced. So initially, so you have the market money, the trader money, and the rest. And then the normal basic one where people that were on bank, there was a big drive. So what is the value for money or the cost benefit analysis of getting banks? Because the banks were also an issue. There were lots of entry point barrier where people couldn't register at the bank because you wanted them, those that are farmers, their thumb prints will never work, right? Why are you still stuck on they having to do thumb printing? There's other means in which they could. So they were engaged, the banks were engaged to make sure that they kind of reduce the registration, bank opening requirements. Because I think we achieved almost like 40%, but then it was reverted again when the second term, when the humanitarian ministry was set up. But yeah, there is no reason for us to be giving people cash at the moment, right? The JIP program was able to onboard a lot of people. They initially gave like 5,000 naira to people. It will cost much more, like almost 15,000 per person for us to drive the change to get them registered. So giving them 5,000 and not having to request that they pay back was something to use. So then the next, you are then qualified for the next disbursement, which is 10,000 or 15,000, I can't quite remember at the time, and through your bank. So if you want to get, and that was an incentive. So if you want to get the next loan, and that then would be a loan, you must have been registered at the bank because it was transferred into your bank account. And then the next stage was about 30,000. You must have been in a cooperative where if you are a clay maker or a clay pot maker or a cara fryer, you constitute yourself within the community where we are 10 of us within this community. Shola is first giving before Patrick is giving. Then Shola must pay because there is a communal requirement.
So,
Yes, where you see Patrick every day, and then you know that Patrick doesn't have a loan because I've not paid. So there was a lot of repayment, positive repayment. So we have no reason to give cash in the first place. That system should work, and it's good that the present administration is continuing with the NC program, the NC intervention. However, it has to be rejigged to look at the household targeted approach. However, I must say that that is not enough because in designing the NCIP at the time, it wasn't looking at evidence data. And we know that infrastructure is very important. We cannot reduce poverty without collaboration with the private sector. Private sector companies in industrialization, those that do manufacturing and production needs to be, subsidies needs to be given to them. Quite a number of things that can be done to do that, yeah.
So if we look around the world and, we look around some countries that are within our peer group who've also dealt with poverty questions and have exited or lifted a number of people out of poverty. What are some of the design elements of their poverty eradication programs, that you found interesting that we can also be looking to implement in Nigeria?
Yeah, I would say example that comes readily to mind is India again, right? Even though they've fallen back into poverty for several reasons, right? So India, within 10 years, 2026 to 2016, there were 275 million people that exited extreme poverty. So there's a difference between poverty and extreme poverty where all of the just like Nigerians will say goes back, you're just being hit right, left, center with deprivations, right? And so then an additional 140 million exited another about 5 years. So that was almost, so they moved their MPI from 55% to about 16%. And that's quite interesting to look at. We have examples of Colombia and so that's for the MPI. So what did India do differently? And those are the kind of conversations we're already having. So for you to reduce poverty, you need to change your budgeting system. Are you just arbitrarily giving figures to say, okay, security, you have this, education have, what is the data telling us, and where are you directing that to? The intervention of federal government to the state, you are not just giving them 300 billion, 500 million and whatever. What are the conditions that are attached that are given to the state? So if Ondo State is being given money, you must say that this is your scorecard in terms of where the poverty is, and we want to reduce it. Then you must allocate this money to that point. So that was what India did. India did use the MPI indicators and the results to create what we call the ministerial performance tracking system, where the president himself and some other high-level ministers were in charge of. So for Nigeria could be Usman Bala, who is the special advisor to the president on policy, using that to pinpoint, because when you reduce poverty, because it's multidimensional and not just the monetary, it covers almost all of the sectors, right? So that was one thing that they did quite well. So you're using that as a ministerial performance appraiser. The other thing that they did, they collaborated with the National Social Register. The National Social Register gets unfairly criticized, but I know for sure that the data are real. Maybe how it is used is different, because the data is then given to the private sector. Dangote Foundation uses it, several other people use Save the Children, the World Bank, and the rest use it, right? So it's just data, a repository of data. Within the NSR, it shows you the distance between where Shola lives and the next PHC, private healthcare center. It shows me access to bank, infrastructure, lights, and stuff. So that data is just there for people to use, but it's very, very much underutilized. So what they did was they targeted, in terms of creating projects, they created targeted programs so that they go within the NSR, even if the NSR has a shortcoming, it can be reviewed, right? So, and I'm not saying the kind of survey for improvement of the NSR that the now suspended Minister of Humanitarian did, because you can never update the social register within a year. It is not possible. So saying that you updated the data within 1 month, it's not possible, because the process is forced such that everybody within the community, it starts within the community where you do proximity testing. People identify, the poor can even identify the very poor amongst them. So you go to a community and say, oh, there isn't smoke coming out from these people's house. It shows that even though if they can gather wood to cook, to set the fire, they don't have meals, whatever to cook. So the first thing is the community identify who is poor amongst them. And then this proximity testing that is done standard-wise globally by the World Bank is then used, the scientific measurement, where then you look at what are the infrastructure. Do you have a fridge? Do you have assets? Do you have cow? Do you have car? All of those things. And then there's a community day, like market day, where everybody comes to the community center and then review it and say, okay, yes, it's affected. It is pasted within the community. And then before it gets to LGA level, then the state will have their state social register. That state social register is what then is sent to the federal, which is NASCO. NASCO is National Social Safety Net Coordinating Office, to review it with the World Bank experts. So that is what is done. So you can imagine some people, like when we're doing the Naira redesign, somewhere in Niger, yes, there were some people that will be at the farm for about 3 months, right, before they come back into the city. So there isn't a time where you can give it. So if within that kind of community, you want to have a community conversation around poor poverty, you are never going to have it within 1 day or 2 days. And then you go back. So it takes over almost a year for that to be done. So they did targeting, the design of the program that they had after their results in 2006. They used that to do program targeting. And so there are quite a number of things. Also, but 3 things are quite the budgeting, the ministerial performance appraisal, and also targeting. I can talk also on Indonesia, where the BRAC ultra poor graduation initiative implements, which is quite interesting.
I think that's a good conversation to have, because one of the challenges we have in Nigeria is that people get into these programs, but they never exit, and the one that comes to mind is an area where both of us have also worked, in the Niger Delta, where you had the presidential amnesty program paying 65,000 naira to a bunch of people. which was supposed to happen like 3 times, but then ended up happening for multiple years, right? So many of these people who are now getting funded through the NC program, what's the plan? How do you graduate people, out of this poverty? And if you can speak a little bit to that and how it may have worked in other parts of the country, of the world.
We should partner with maybe BRAC, for instance, understudy why it's working in Indonesia, understudy India why it worked, because India is comparable to Nigeria in terms of population, ethnicity, and quite. Let's look at why it worked, right? The reason why I can quickly say it doesn't work before was the continuity of government, but the Buhari administration did continue a bit of the short pay, and this present administration is continuing the NC program, but putting the square peg in square holes as quite important, understanding the historical data, historical perspective, historical situation of Nigeria, so that you can then come more informed around that. So, but for BRAC, so basically we just need to understudy all of those things. I think if we go back to the drawing board in terms of NCIP as it was originally designed, we can achieve a lot more, but it's not enough. The social contract between government and the citizen is quite breached a lot, so that needs to be also looked at. But aside from the NCIP, there should be quite a number of other activities that are data-driven and provides evidence. Like I keep emphasizing, the infrastructure is quite important. Should be for the next pandemic. Of course, the Ministry of Health should be prepared for vaccines, research and development, and quite a number of that I can't fully speak to at the moment.
Sure, and for participants, we're going to open it up for questions and comments. Just use the Q&A tab and post your questions. We will attribute it to the person who has a question. I find the BRAC example quite interesting. On how the pillars of trying to graduate people out of poverty. They looked at how do you meet their basic needs. They looked at what are some of the programs that will support income generation, financial support and savings and social empowerment. You spoke a little bit earlier on about this idea that is making the waves around liberals all over the world about like universal basic income. I don't know if there is any hope for that succeeding, although the data is still very inconclusive, even where it's being practiced. But what are some of your thoughts on maybe some kind of a living allowance for the people we clearly identify as being ultra desperately poor? And what's your sense for Nigeria's ability to fund such a program?
So within the cash transfer that we have in Nigeria, the one people hear more is the unconditional cash transfer, where 5,000 is given to people monthly. But there's the other part where it's unconditional cash transfer. Conditional cash transfer, right? Where you call it the unconditional, you are giving 5,000. You are not assuming that you know what the poor needs, because if you give them 5,000, especially men, those days they will, marry more wives, and
who marries a wife with 5,000 naira? Shola, you guys you keep dumping on us. Who marries a wife with 5,000 naira?
I've been on the field. I know sometimes, we that are wearing our suits or sitting behind us just don't quite connect with the reality. The first time we did the cash transfer, somebody brought what we call Ghana Must Go, right? To collect 5,000, because in their lifetime they've never held together 5,000 what it is. So the 5,000, it was quite something, and people also criticize using 17 naira for school feeding, because what obtains in the schools, within the villages, it's just nothing. And then when you look at the volume, that's where they get their profit from. So it's quite it's quite, yes. So what was my thoughts now?
So you were talking about, maybe the universal basic income, the ability to do it, and the component within the NC program for, conditional transfer.
Yes. So the conditional cash transfer is where to address mortality rate. So you have to, pregnant woman must go register at for antenatal, right? When you register over a period of time, then you're entitled to a particular, so it drives down the mortality rate, right? So if your child, you have not pulled out your child from school and the registration, I mean, the attendance is not low, you're entitled to a particular. So it helps incentivize the entire process. So so there is cash, there is money, there is funds for those kind of intervention. But when we hear the UBI, because we've not implemented this in Nigeria, I've not looked very closely to, but it's quite interesting. I've read a bit of some literature about it. But of course, anything that is being globally practiced, contextualizing or localizing in Nigeria will be an interesting thing to look at. But I think what is being done by the cash transfer office would suffice with the just proper monitoring to close the loopholes in terms of corruption. The conditional cash transfer is quite helpful looking at, and that is what the UBI is likely to want to address.
Fantastic. So I have a question in the Q&A tab from Abdulrazak Karim, and his question is, the MPI is not gender disaggregated. Why?
Okay, so before surveys are done, right? Thanks for the feedback. So that was stated within the report that there wasn't sufficient time to do a lot of disaggregation, but there are quite some interesting disaggregation around number of girls that are going to school versus boys, women-headed households, the poverty rates versus the ones that are bailed. But it didn't quite do justice in terms of the very detailed disaggregation that is considered gendered analysis. No, it didn't do that.
Is there any effort in the National Bureau of Statistics to take that into consideration for the next go-around?
Yes, absolutely. The MPI is quite a heavy, it takes quite a number of funds, and they were supported by development partners, UNDP, the Canadian High Commission, and the likes of them, right? However, if I were to put myself in the shoes, I wouldn't want to sponsor another survey if the data currently as it sits has not been fully integrated within the programming or influence policy. So that's the conversation, and then the activities are holding at the moment. The other thing is that those data are being taken to the subnational to influence the budgeting preparation, and also constituting or to address child-related poverty for anything that is as such. Yeah. So right now is just the data demand and use strategy that is being implemented at the moment. There isn't exact on the next survey, but it will be.
How well did the Governors Forum embrace the report and try to use that to advocate with their states, to integrate the data in their budgeting process and also in looking at just broad development policies at the state level?
Yeah, I must say firstly that, of course, I am no longer the national coordinator for the MPI. Like I said, the president launched the report November 2022. And then that was just on the heel of the next election. So because you had a government that is APC trying to give government power to another APC. So managing the conversations around, in spite of the 500 billion that you do every year, why do you still have 1.3 million people in poverty? So conversations, we couldn't engage the government because there are panics here and there around that. So because I've left now, but I do support the team around that. So those conversations are being held to make alignment. And I think Carol or something, Dr. Yes, I did speak with him at the time to collaborate, but that would be something to take forward.
Fantastic. Another question from Abdulrazak Karim is, he's concerned about the non-coordinated efforts amongst the MDAs. So no MDA can work in isolation when it comes to poverty eradication. They need to work together to ensure coordinated effort and prevent duplication of efforts. And I know that this may not have been articulated during the MPI, but in the subsequent conversations, did you find that the government of Nigeria was moving towards a kind of a whole of government approach to poverty reduction and not just something that is left for SMIDAN? You know, is there more of that approach back in the Buhari administration, and are you seeing that now in the Ashiwadu administration?
Yes, leadership matters, right? And I see that the present administration is doing a lot of activities. The last administration did not have a coordinating minister. Now we have a coordinating minister of the economy. And so that's why there are lots of quick responses to public outcry in terms of embezzlement or suspected embezzlement and the rest of that, because the Ministry of Humanitarian is supposed to drive a lot of this. Aside, the Ministry of Planning and the Ministry of Budget and Economic Planning also plays a vital role, because it's the unifying ministry that can bring all of the agencies together, and it's not being seen as being one minister having, you can get to the political space of that. The other opportunity that I see that we are not seizing is the role of the special advisor on policy, who does the performance for all the MDAs, basically all of the appointees of the president, those are the heading ministers, DGs, and the rest. Is an opportunity for not just to use it as a performance appraiser, but also a coordinating process jointly done with the coordinating minister. You see that people are not working in silos, but there is a uniformed approach marching toward reducing poverty in all of its forms.
We have a question from Aminu Usman, and it's about President Lula of Brazil and his conditional cash transfer, which he implemented in his first tenure. And I guess his question is, are there any lessons we have considered from the quite successful Brazilian experiment?
I cannot speak for the activity because I'm not that familiar with it, but I'm familiar with their school feeding program, which I had visited at the time. Something they're familiar or something. And that was what we benchmarked for our homegrown school feeding in Nigeria. We literally copied and pasted, because
what were the elements of that program that you found to have been successful?
It was homegrown. So instead of having to call the Dangotes, for instance, to supply Indomie. So that's why the school feeding program in Nigeria didn't work like that. It needed to be food that is identified within the community, where people are encouraged to have farms within. Yeah, that's one thing. And of course, the entire process of how it worked was what was adopted in Nigeria. Sure. But in terms of cash transfer, I'm not that familiar.
Sure. So there's a question from Danjuma Abdullahi. How is it possible to reduce poverty without functional industries? Most funds for poverty alleviation are usually looted. That's a direct blow at your program, Shola. He says it's usually looted. How do we address ensure funds get to the right beneficiaries? So in the minds of most Nigerians, they believe that, the NCIP program, most of the funds were looted. Can you explain to us the checks and balances that you guys designed into that program to prevent corruption? And as someone who ran the M&E on the program, can you speak to how successful or not, the program was vis-a-vis this risk of people looting the money?
Yeah. So I must first say that wherever human beings, just like we talked in terms of poverty, wherever human beings are, I don't think poverty is gonna, completely eradicated. So also corruption, because people actually want to, earlier I talked about JIP. Why were we able to recover most of the loan? Because we have the communal trust thing. People just feel, oh, it's my turn now to get my national cake. So they don't want to pay back, right? So I'll give an example, the Empower. We want to know whether the person, the teacher, the Empower teacher goes to school to actually lecture, because they're giving 30,000 naira per day. So then you are given a device. Within a device, you can track when you are at school and make reports from there and stuff, because it's just like NYSC. Some people are posted a particular place, they connive with an official and say, me, I don't want to, I want to travel abroad. Please just be taking my 30,000. I don't want to show up. So it defeats what the social economic gains that the NYSC activity is done. So what we discovered was people just say the device is missing. You get what I mean? And they go online and shout and say, oh, I'm not being paid. So at some point, there were some payment process that was on people, because a lot of Nigerians at the time were saying, no, people are not being paid, it's a lie, there are no Empower and whatever. And then you have the data policy of data and privacy policy of Nigeria, where you can publish the names of the people. So, but everyone began to go out and say, I'm not being paid. I will pay so and so time, but now I've not been paid for next month. So people say, okay, so these people do exist. But I cannot entirely rule out issues where, especially those that were doing the cash transfer, where they have been, caught complicit, because when you take cash to a particular place, you have to also do some security manning of the place, because there was a particular community, or quite a number of communities, where the youth of the community knows when they are going to give the women cash. So they form themselves to the vigilante and say, we want to guard you, right? Some of them follow the women to their home to collect the money, so all of those things were, so it's rife at different levels of the administration. But I would say, I'm only speaking for the 4 or 3 years of 2016 to about 2019, when the program was under the office of the vice president. I wouldn't be able to speak because I had left at the time when it was at the humanitarian ministry.
But did you find that some of the lessons that we, so when you run the M&E, there's some lessons you learn. Did you find that there was a process for integrating those lessons into reshaping the program or into new program design? If not, what were the challenges from translating those lessons into new programs?
Yeah, so there are lots of biannual outcome harvesting and feedback. So one of the things that we had done was to work with EFCC and DSS. I had all the officials within those states. So they do investigation, right? So we had what we call independent monitors. These independent monitors are representative of people at the National Assembly. And they have responsibility, oversight responsibility, to monitor how the budget is performing that was released to a particular ministry or program. So we had representatives from the National Assembly that were independent monitors. So there is a bit of triangulation of feedback that we collect. So we collect from those independent monitors. We also collect from DSS, and then, of course, ICPC. So ICPC and EFCC, they have their own point. I think ICPC only prosecute those that are civil servants, and EFCC is like everybody. So I had reports from all of the states every month from DSS. So then the report that is submitted by independent monitors versus the compared every month. So, and then people are interrogated, and you just scare people not to know that people are actually watching. But people want that scheme, the system is still skidded. But a lot of feedback was done throughout. Yeah.
Okay, so I have a question from a Tonweight, Michael. He says, thank you for your insightful contributions. But here's the question. Do social assistance programs effectively address the needs of the poor? What suggestions do you have for the government to enhance poverty alleviation efforts in Nigeria and uplift the most vulnerable, fostering sustainable escape from poverty? I mean, to achieve sustainable escape from poverty, where beneficiaries are protected from falling back into poverty. So most of the things we've talked about have been around alleviation, solving the problems they have today, but we also talked about them not really exiting that bucket, once they're in there. Are there some thoughts on how to sustainably lift people out of poverty so that they don't ever fall back into it again?
Yeah, so two fronts I would look at that. I would look at the original way that the NCP was designed, and I also look at the BRAC Ultra Poor Graduation Initiative, right? Okay, so for the cash transfer that I mentioned, the conditional and the unconditional cash transfer. Within the conditional cash transfer, there is a training and research and support that is done for people to be empowered in terms of budgeting, planning, and doing a lot of things, because those are the things that sustain them out of poverty, right? Now, if you want to scale your business, also you should be banked, and you should have access to loans. So those are the things that you can actually do to see graduation from. So you should be cohesive, like the other person that mentioned, Usman. I think instead of the MDAs working in silos or the interventions of the government not really targeted to identify or use data to inform those design, is very important for that to be done. So then going to the BRAC. So like I said, if NCP goes back to the original way, it can really help. The other thing I'd mentioned earlier was we can't just do NCP or do subsidies. I mean, cash transfers and free lunch every time. We have to also look at subsidies within the industries. So within the agriculture sector, within energy sector, within even taxes, like tax revenues, we have to make sure that we are not labeling those that will pass on the cost of the taxes being deducted from them onto the very poor people. You get 5,000 today. By the time you want to buy something, tax and deductions are eroded everything. So looking at that, the design closely and making sure that there is a graduation process being done, just like the BRAC. BRAC is something I would strongly suggest for us to consider. Yes, benchmarking in Nigeria.
There's a question.
Yeah. Go on.
There's a question from an Abasiopon Uduak, and it's when talking about poverty reduction in Nigeria, we hardly comment on social cohesion of the country. What's your opinion on this? You know, if there is no real, so the argument I think he or she is making is that if there is no social cohesion, we may not bring a whole of Nigeria effort, push, to address poverty. We may see it, in the past, we used to see it as a northern problem, but now it's coming further down south. Even the southeast that used to be seen as the best or the least poor region in the country. If you look at the MPI numbers, between 2018 and 2022, poverty increased in the southeast, by double digits. So no one is spared this challenge. So if there is no social cohesion, can we really address the poverty problem in Nigeria?
So let me just clarify what my understanding of the social cohesion and this means to be. I will use like an example, right? Is that ethnicity or?
Part of it, so if it's like a good example is if when we had Boko Haram in Borno State, and it was restricted to Borno State. Many people saw it as a Maiduguri problem and not a Nigeria problem, but because we did not bring a whole of Nigeria effort to solving that problem, that insecurity has now cascaded to the rest of the country, and morphed into not just Boko Haram, but ISWAP, banditry, et cetera, I think the question is asking is, if we don't have a sense of oneness as Nigerians, can we really convince ourselves that we're trying to solve a problem that is really a national problem?
Yeah, so it's very important and critical that we overlook. It's just like when we're having conversation around poverty, I mean population. The population will always, the poverty rate will always go up the more population that we have, right? Except we have like a systemic way that India did it, that in the 10 years that they reduced poverty from 50 something to 16, population was booming, right? But I would say that an example, and for poverty and like corruption, wherever human beings are, right? From a Christian faith, it's just like Babel. People will not agree. It's just husband and wife, your tongue and your teeth, and it's just so assuming that there will be a total cohesion is not exactly. So it will take us, to the constitution to review a lot of conversation. But I would say, for instance, in the Southeast, when we were doing the school feeding, there were a lot of issues that happened that we didn't quite get initially, because what happens is the federal government says we will feed primary 1 to 3. For us to implement school feeding at the state government must agree to feed primary 4 to 6. Because we learned in the pilot state that was done, children don't want to exit primary 3 because they are fed. Instead of going to promoted primary 4, they said, no, I don't want, because they are always fed. So we wanted to make sure that that is done. However, in the Southeast, there are some cultural and religious issues that we didn't envisage. When you want to do meritocratic process in selecting people, you also need to consider the context that is there. That's when I learned that the Catholics cannot feed the Protestant, so if you have a cook, that you have done the screening, you have done everything, and you assign them to a school that you have Catholics, they're not going to feed, they're not going to accept the food. You get what I mean? So those are content so we have to now adjust. So we're still trying to use the meritocratic process, but also, whether you lower the standard or increase the standard to make sure that it's fit for purpose, or else the overall goal that you want to achieve will not be achieved. So in terms of cultural, it's just as diverse as our languages that we have. We have over 300, going to 400 languages. So it's never going to be perfect. But you are right in the sense that the social cohesion would happen. But my own take would be, for instance, we can start with the state of origin. They will always ask people, Patrick, where is your state of origin? Shola, where's your state of origin? It kind of creates like a barrier. I think maybe that's where to start. But yeah, it's out of my pay grade.
Interesting. We have a question from a Saleh Balami. His question is it more efficient to provide people with farm inputs, storage facilities, and markets for their products than direct cash transfer with all the attendant leakages? And I think it also plays into a question we got earlier on. Shouldn't we be looking at creating opportunities for these people to sell more of their produce, extend the shelf life, et cetera, versus putting Band-Aid, on, really an amputated leg? So that's one question, but in answering that question, maybe it's to consider that there are people who've fallen so far down, in poverty, that you must lift them up to a particular level for them to be able to even access many of these things that we're talking about. So that's the question. Over to you.
Yeah, so a lot of, within the public space, people hear more of NSIP, the cash transfer, but they hear less of the other interventions that are poverty related that each of the MDAs actually are involved in. For instance, Ministry of Agri does the AFJP, and it's still within the budget and it's still being implemented. AFJP is Agri for Food and Job Plan. And you have these intensives. Earlier, I mentioned rural roads because access to markets so that you don't have spoilage, along the road. Cold storage also is being provided. You hear every time, maybe scandal or whatever, but it shows that there is some activities being done around fertilizers, right? And then also insurance, So yeah, there are a lot of intervention. So that is correct. Cash transfer should always go with targeted subsidies within whatever sector they were trying to address poverty issues.
To promote production, to promote industrialization, etc. I knew we were going to get this question. Hardly will you have a conversation in Nigeria without somebody going to the constitution. So this question is from Olajide Olagunju. I wonder if we can seriously deal with poverty problems without denationalizing the economy, which is a problem that is now a 55-year-old challenge since the military nationalized it. First petroleum in November 1969 and other local patrimony subsequently, which nationalization has made worse by making it constitutional since 1979. So the question is really, can we solve problem if we keep running this kind of unitary government we run, where everything starts from the center? Shouldn't we push down devolve powers, push things down to the states and local governments, and have them deal with poverty from those levels. Shola?
Yes, I'm a strong advocate for devolution of power to LGAs, because those are the people that are closest to the people. The data shows that almost 70% of those that account for MPI poverty, poor people, are in the rural areas, and the closest people is the LGA. President Buhari at the time made all the attempts, even constitutionally and legally, to make sure that state government, make LGAs receive direct funds from the federal, but the state sued the federal government. Yeah, so there is a citizenship advocacy that needs to be trumped up, where people are actually asking their state government, not just federal. That conversation should be lowered quite a bit. But in terms of the constitution, and I'm not a constitutional lawyer, I can't exactly speak to that, but I do agree that the constitution needs to be revisited, reviewed. But I see some steps being taken by the different government. So if you want to just bite the entire cake, it's not possible. You have been having constitutional reviews every time. What is being done with the reports is another conversation. Right. But like the last administration, what the President Buhari did was with the ERGP was to make sure that what is the major thing that we can improve within. Maybe in the north, the granite pyramid that we can rejig. Maybe in Kaduna, the textile manufacturing thing. Just make sure that everyone is fully empowered. The question the citizens should also ask is the security votes that are given to governors that are not accounted for. Those are things that people should actually, a lot of advocacy, NGOs within the advocacy sector with social protection and whatever should come out and ask vital questions.
Fantastic.
But I'll let you answer.
So we have a question from Omar Bendri, who good mentor of mine, did fantastic work as DG of NOTAP and SSG Adamawa State government, and actually did some work in NCIP as well. His question is, each poverty alleviation program of the federal government in the last 25 years has their specific focus. And in his opinion, they all achieve their objectives reasonably. The signals of failure is in impact assessment, which traditionally require at least 3 years of uninterrupted implementation to assess. This we do not do, including just leaving it to run for the 3 years, and in the end, we politicize the view on effectiveness. What's your view? What's your view on this position?
Is absolutely correct. Being an M&E expert, 22 years, so I completely agree. However, when the program needs to, is being implemented, there are lots of pre-project launch planning that needs to be done, consultation, buy-in, design and stuff. You can always begin to collect feedback through monitoring, right? And then evaluation can begin when you do outcome harvesting, because there's some immediate outcome, long-term outcome that you can get. And of course, impact assessment is really done 3 years down the line when the project started. So that's why the first phase of the NCIP was after 3 years of implementation that was done. So continuity is usually a problem in Nigeria. So the feedback that was done in the impact assessment should have informed the continued design. And that is what should have been done. I would suggest to be recommended to be done also within the present administration. What is the impact assessment? Where are the impact assessment reports for 2016 to 2019 of the NCIP, for 2019 to 2023 of the NCIP, and then use that to inform the new design for not just being distracted by also some suspected embezzlement or whatever it is, but let's focus on the data and how we can use that to improve the system.
Right.
Yeah.
And in fact, how do you use insights from the impact assessment to reshape the design? No design is perfect. You just keep improving on it until it gets much better. There's a question from Dr. Bandele Amo. Thanks for your submission. What really bothers him is why the government did not make the social register comprehensive before payments, right? So the question is, how comprehensive was the social register? And then and he claims that it lacks integrity. The conditional cash transfer failed because it was done randomly, and some people got different programs while others did not. Shola, these are direct accusations, Shola. You've got to give direct answers here.
Yes, yeah. So so the World Bank sponsors the development for the NSR, right? And so you can imagine the very rigorous process of funds being released.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and then they have different checkpoints that can be done. I think people they confuse the NSR, the National Social Register, with the cash office. So the social register is something that you and I, Nextier, Dangote Foundation, individual people can go in there and get information of, I want to target people in Gwagwalada that don't have access to water because my project addresses that. They will give you that information that is very targeted. That's what the social register is. And I did explain the process of formulating the social register. Every social register that you see at the federal level is actually, you have the base at the state level. There is a state social register before you have the federal social register. I wouldn't say I can't, well, let me leave it at that. But the cash transfer, the social register, so during COVID, it was discovered that the social register does not suffice to quickly respond and give incentives and government intervention. Because, for instance, if you know Abuja, or let me use the example of Lagos or Abuja. So Abuja, you have people living in Asokoro or Maitama. They are not targeted when they do surveys. However, there are poor people living within those houses because we have domestic staff there. So they are excluded. So during COVID, there was like a basket of Save the Children, Multilateral, and the NGOs that came together and quickly sponsored the development of what we call the RRR. That is the Rapid Response Register, to capture the urban poor that were not captured within the social register, because the social register usually goes to the hinterlands, the rural areas, to capture those. And then the incentives then are sent to people. But it's quite interesting that there should be some other, we should be flexible. I know that the people that initially tagged Nigeria poverty capital of the world, what they had looked at in terms of subjective data was, okay, if I flash Patrick instead of really calling Patrick several times, it shows that I could be poor. And in Lagos State also, during the COVID, what they did was to look at the bank accounts of people, and say, okay, so what's there? What's the frequency? How do you recharge? Do you recharge 5 naira and 10 naira or whatever? Or do you call only at midnight when there is it book of, those days where they do all of those? Yeah. So you identify people using alternative means to quickly, all of this came under scrutiny and criticism, but it's never going to be a perfect, it's just, iterate as you go.
Sure. So we're down to the last 2 minutes, and let me give you a chance to kind of wrap everything up with a question. Based on your experience and expertise, what do you believe are the essential elements of a successful poverty reduction program in Nigeria? What would be the essential elements, and what are the primary challenges that need to be addressed in designing and implementing such programs, especially at the national level? We're down to 2 minutes.
Right. I would say thank you to the participant that mentioned cohesion amongst MDAs. So we should be able to have a commonality instead of a standalone approach to poverty reduction in Nigeria. And it will be a recommendation that the special advisor policy and also the coordinating minister can look into to be able to track. The other thing I would say is essential is we have development partners and different people funding a particular. So for instance, I can go to Sokoto and I see a well that has been done, borehole that's been done. You have it in the budget for Ministry of Water Resources. You also have it at DFID. You also have it at, the same, duplicity of that. So I would highly recommend that within the budget office or within the Ministry of Finance, you should have a SEM, what I call social expenditure monitoring, to be able to address that. And not that also should come, the budgeting should be data informed in terms of evidence, and data informed in terms of our budgeting process. So the coordinating of the different social protection and welfare activities that we do in Nigeria should be data driven and cohesive. Second is the SEM process, and of course using data to influence design of projects and quite a number of things. Yeah, I hope that helps.
Fantastic. Thank you, Shola, for joining us in this discussion. Very rich, and there are many points that we've raised that should inform policy going forward. And for everyone who joined us, thank you so much for joining us again today to discuss this topic. In 2 weeks' time, we'll be meeting with Dr. Zainab Usman. She's the founding director of the Africa Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and we'll be speaking on rebuilding Nigeria's economy in challenging times. The discussion is on May 15th, 3 to 4:30 p.m. West Africa time. Thank you so much for joining, and see you again in a fortnight. Thanks.